welcome to Dr. Nicola Dawson. And we are looking at a very different kind of corpus that's been analyzed. This is perhaps one of the biggest child-directed corpora available internationally. So over to you, Nikki.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Yes, so I'm going to be talking about morphology again, this time, as Shanali said, focusing on English, and thinking about it in the context of the development of orthography to meaning links. So this is a large-scale corpus study looking at a wide kind of range of children's texts. So I think the very important point has been made that reading research in general does tend to be very Anglo-centric, but I think there is a general principle that knowledge of the writing system, whichever writing system that is, can inform how we understand reading behaviour and reading development. So that was really the starting point for this kind of approach to our research. So in English, there are two primary sources of regularity. So firstly, we see regularities in the mappings between spelling and sound. And we see this in words such as cat, mat, and hat, where words that have similar spellings also have similar pronunciations. But although these words are similar in form, they don't overlap in any respect in terms of their meaning. But many words in English are morphologically complex, particularly when we look at more advanced language. And these words share not only phonological and orthographic structure, but also their meanings as well. So for example, the base word lock is semantically consistent across the words unlock, lockable, and relock. And similarly, the function of the derivational suffix meaning a person who performs the act that's denoted by the base word, is consistent across words like teacher, writer, and farmer. So for this reason, morphemes have been described as islands of regularity in this otherwise arbitrary relationship between form and meaning. So in the developmental reading literature particularly, morphological knowledge has usually been evaluated through morphological awareness tasks, where children are asked to explicitly manipulate or reflect on morphological structure, or through the lens of vocabulary acquisition. But actually exposure to written language might be particularly important in the development of morphological knowledge. And this is because orthography provides cues to meaning that are less salient in spoken language. And this has been shown really nicely in some recent corpus work, where findings suggest that spellings of English derivational suffixes are closely associated with the part of speech indicated by that suffix. So for example, the suffix us, O-U-S, attaches to words to form adjectives, as in the case of words like nervous and dangerous and so on. So adjectives ending in the sound sequence us are almost always spelled using O-U-S. However, words ending in that same sound sequence that are nouns or other parts of speech take on a different spelling pattern. So in these examples, US. So while this introduces inconsistency in the relationship between the letters and the sounds, because obviously this us sound sequence can be spelled multiple ways, it does bring greater consistency to the relationship between spelling and meaning. And this direct link between spelling and meaning is a really important pathway to skilled and efficient word reading. So from a developmental perspective, this is why exposure to print may be so important for morphology, because in spoken language, if there are a number of word endings sharing the same phonological form but not the same meaning, as in the case of words ending in us, then the links between suffix form and meaning may be less obvious. So it's only when children learn to read and see that adjectives ending in us are consistently spelled O-U-S, while non-adjectives with the same ending are spelled differently, that they can properly appreciate the consistency in the relationship between form and meaning. And evidence does suggest that skilled readers are sensitive to these patterns. So for example, if we present individuals with a made-up word that ends in O-U-S, then they're more likely to classify that word as an adjective than if we present them with the same non-word but spelled with a US ending, for example. And we also see effects of morphological structure play out in reading behaviour when we look at skilled readers. So for example, in a lexical decision task, where individuals are asked to decide whether an item is a real word or not, they find it more difficult to reject a made-up word that is morphologically structured, such as a word like earist, which combines a stem and an existing suffix, compared to a closely matched control word, non-word that doesn't have an existing suffix like earilt. And we see the opposite effect when with real words, so that people are quicker to recognise a word like teach when it follows a morphological relative like teacher compared to an unrelated prime. And when this prime is presented very briefly, we even see this effect extended to words like corner that only have the appearance of morphological structure at the level of orthography, but aren't actually linked in meaning to the base word. So this suggests that knowledge about these morpho-orthographic patterns has become embedded in the reading system for skilled readers. But evidence for this is less robust in developing readers, and this is kind of somewhat unsurprising, given that a deep understanding of these form to meaning links depends on exposure to written language, as we've just seen. So the question of what this input from written language looks like at different stages of reading development was the starting point for this work I'm talking about today. So our aim was to examine morphological complexity in a large scale corpus of written texts aimed at children. So the idea was that this would provide a springboard for future experimental work, examining how features of morphology in writing relate to morphological effects in word recognition at different stages of reading development. And our main interest was with variation by target age, which we grouped here into key stage, which essentially refers to educational level in the UK, determined by a child's age. But we also looked at variation in morphological complexity across genre too, given that we had reason to expect that non-fiction texts are generally written in a more formal register than fiction, and therefore certain categories of derivational suffixes may be more commonly encountered in these types of texts. And then our final aim was to relate the frequencies that we derive from the corpus to reading behaviour. So we conducted this analysis using the Oxford Children's Corpus. So this is a large corpus of reading materials aimed at children aged between 5 and 16 years. It was developed and is owned by Oxford University Press, and in its current form, it consists of around 21,000 documents for a total word count of around 47 million words. So it is a pretty sizable sample of written language. And the reading materials in this corpus are sampled from a wide variety of sources, including fiction, non-fiction, curriculum materials, and text from websites. And the corpus includes data on metadata on genre and target age. And as I mentioned here, we're looking at age ranges grouped by key stage. So aside from the metadata that comes with the corpus, at the word level, the corpus is already tagged for things like part of speech and lemma form. And our analysis was based on these lemma forms. So we were looking at morphologically complex words that are formed through derivation and compounding rather than inflection, because as has already been mentioned, the inflectional system in English is very simple compared to other languages that we've heard about today. And children learning English kind of develop mastery of inflectional morphology very early on in development. So really the kind of interest in looking at this wide age range falls more with the kind of derivation and compounding. So the corpus didn't actually contain any information on morphological structure other than obviously the lemmatized forms of the words. So what we had to do was to take each word in the corpus and cross-reference it with an established morphological database, which is known as MorphoLex. And this includes information on the number of morphemes in a word, and it also provides a kind of segmentation of the morphological structure into bases and affixes. Not all of the words in the children's corpus were available in the morphology database, so we hand-coded the remainder with some help from linguistics students. So just to give you a couple of examples of what this kind of analysis looked like, so we would classify each word as either monomorphemic or complex, and then you've got this kind of segmentation structure. So we have for the word ability, the base word able, and then the derivational suffix ity. And then for inability, we additionally have that prefix as well. We then have a simple count of the number of morphemes in each word. And then we classed each word according to the morphological process, so whether it was derived or compound. So just a reminder that our first research question was whether the proportion of complex words in children's texts varied by target age and genre. So this is presented here as the percentage of morphologically complex words in texts targeted at children at different key stages. So on the left are the percentage of total word tokens that were classed as complex, and on the right are the percentage of total word types. And this is broken down by the type of morphological process. So green shows the derived words, such as words like teacher. Blue shows compounds, so words like football. And pink shows words that were either derived compounds, so a word like footballer, or compounds in which one of the components was a derivation itself, so a word like anteater. And we can clearly see an increase in complex words by key stage, and this seems to be driven in particular by an increase in the proportion of derived words. And we see a similar pattern when we compare across genre. So the overall proportion of complex words is greater in non-fiction compared to fiction, and again, this difference seems to be mainly down to the proportion of derived words. So we can clearly see that the proportion of complex words in text increases in line with developmental stage and also differs across genre. But how does this play out in the frequencies of individual suffixes? So this was the aim with our second research question. We asked whether the distribution of individual derivational suffixes in texts varies according to target age and genre. And we focused on derivational suffixes specifically because derived words have been the focus of most experimental studies of morphological processing. And also we know from the work I mentioned previously that links between suffix spellings and lexical category seem to be a particularly important feature of English. So using a chi-square approach, we found that the distribution of suffixes was significantly associated with key stage, the results here. So the diagram plots the residuals for the suffixes that were most strongly associated with a particular key stage. So here the positive values are shown in blue, while negative values are shown in red, and the intensity of the colour and size of the circle are proportional to the size of the residual. So the suffixes most closely associated with reading materials targeted at the youngest children were li, which forms adverbs, for example, a word like happily, e, forming adjectives like sleepy, and also diminutives like doggy, and also full, which forms adjectives. So these suffixes are considered neutral in that they tend to attach to freestanding base words, and they also don't usually change the pronunciation of the base either. Li and E are also among the suffixes showing the most growth in children's spontaneous language production between 2 and 5 years, but full doesn't appear so frequently in children's early language production. And one reason might be that it's more typical of written language, particularly because adjectives occur more commonly in books. And by contrast, the suffixes most closely associated with key stage 4 texts, so the oldest children, include suffixes like ants in a word like disturbance, shun we see in action, ity as in security, and nus, which we see in words like happiness. All of these form nouns, and in the case of shun and ity, these tend to be used in Latin forms and often attached to bound stems or involve a shift in the pronunciation of the base word. So for example, you might note the change in pronunciation of the word act when we add that suffix. Nus is somewhat of an exception in that it is phonologically neutral, but it is typically used to form abstract nouns. So again, it's characteristic of more advanced vocabulary. So turning to the comparisons by genre, in general, the suffixes showing the strongest positive associations with fiction tended to overlap with those that were most characteristic of the text targeted at the youngest children. So for example, again, we see li, e, and full. 2 exceptions here were ants and nus, which were positively associated with fiction, but also underrepresented in texts targeted at the youngest children. And this may relate to the fact that these suffixes create abstract nouns that often relate to personal qualities. So we see this in words like dominance, annoyance, eagerness, politeness. So they're relatively common in fiction, particularly aimed at older readers, while normalized forms in non-fiction are more commonly formed using suffixes from Latin origins. So our analysis of the children's corpus data captures the patterns that are there in written language, but of course we need to look at reading behaviour as well to understand how this input influences reading development. So our first step towards this was to tie together the suffix frequencies that we derive from the corpus with lexical decision performance in skilled readers. So for this, we analysed data taken from the British Lexicon Project, which contains lexical decision, reaction times and accuracy for around 28,000 English words. And we focused on responses to words with a stem and suffix structure, and looking specifically at 80 target derivational suffixes, which are among kind of the most common suffixes overall. And this gave us a data set with around 1,500 items. So we ran two multiple regression models, one with reaction time as the outcome variable and the other with accuracy. The predictors in each model were suffix token frequency, along with other characteristics that we thought might account for some of the variance, so whole word frequency, base frequency, and also word length in letters. So these plots show the estimated coefficients for each predictor, with the reaction time model on the left and the accuracy model on the right. And in both models, the predictor accounting for the most variance was, unsurprisingly, word frequency. But we do also see a significant effect of suffix frequency in both models, even once we take into account word frequency, base frequency, and word length. So words containing higher frequency suffixes were responded to more quickly and accurately on average compared to words containing lower frequency suffixes. You can see this effect a little bit more clearly in these plots, which show the predicted effects of suffix frequency based on the models. So again, reaction time is on the left and accuracy is on the right. And then layered on top, you can see some example suffixes plotted by frequency along the x-axis and mean response values, either reaction times or accuracy. Okay, so in summary, we found that texts targeted at older children contain a higher proportion of morphologically complex words compared to texts targeted at younger children. We also saw that non-fiction texts contain more complex words compared to fiction, and in both cases, these differences seem to be driven by the proportion of derived words. We also found that the distribution of suffix categories varied by age and genre. And that Latinate forms, for example, suffixes like ity, are more common in more advanced texts and also in non-fiction, while suffixes forming abstract nouns, for example, nus, were more common again in advanced texts, but also in fiction. And then finally, we found that skilled readers respond faster and more accurately to words with higher frequency suffixes, even after controlling for word frequency, base frequency, and word length. So where do we go from here, and how might our corpus data inform predictions about reading behaviour at different stages of development? So I think the findings offer a piece in the puzzle of how children learn about morphological relationships, particularly in the context of forming these spelling to meaning links in a way that supports sufficient word recognition. So it's clear from our secondary data analysis that individual suffix frequencies have a bearing on the speed of recognition of words containing those suffixes. And therefore, we might predict that morphological effects in reading behaviour won't emerge in a uniform manner. And importantly, exposure to written language is likely to be key for children to properly appreciate the links that are there between form and meaning. And this is something to consider in approaches to assessment. So if we're interested in what children know about morphology and words in the oral domain, we need to think carefully about whether what we're really testing is knowledge that they're more likely to have acquired from print exposure. And this is particularly relevant when we're assessing children who are only just learning to read. So if we go back to the example of us, can we expect children with very little print exposure to recognise or be sensitive to the meaningful function of that suffix when there are so many exceptions from a kind of phonological perspective? And then finally, thinking more broadly about the advantages and limitations of this kind of corpus-based approach. So one clear benefit is that we're able to document in detail what the written input actually looks like, and also to show how written language provides children with access to certain linguistic structures and patterns that aren't so obvious from spoken language. And at this kind of scale, we can also look at the corpus from a developmental perspective, so we can better understand how features of written language differ according to the proficiency of the reader. And this approach also allows us to identify item level variation at the level of words and also sublexical units such as morphemes, which means that we can make more fine-grained predictions about how these patterns will play out in reading behaviour. And in the context of morphology, while there have been some experimental studies of morphological processing that manipulate factors such as frequency and morphological family size, these are quite rare in the developmental literature. And this is partly because up until now, we don't have a very clear picture of what children's experiences of written morphology actually look like across such a broad age range. But I think certainly we came across some limitations of this approach too. So one is that the scale of the corpus limits the type of analysis that can really be done here. So for example, here I've just talked about frequency counts, but there are likely to be other factors that contribute to children's learning of morphological relationships. So we know that morphology is quasi-regular in that complex words vary in the extent to which their meanings equate to the sum of their parts. And the likelihood is that this also plays into how children learn about these relationships. And so the system they develop actually needs to be quite flexible. Also during coding of our corpus for morphological structure, there was some tension between taking a kind of linguistic view of word structure and coding those sublexical units according to kind of the etymology of the word, and also thinking about an approach to decomposing words based on how today's readers would be likely to perceive them. So for example, a word like permit contains word units that appear in other words like remit, submit, but the meaningful function of that morpheme is unclear. And finally, I think the corpus approach offers one tool for understanding child language and literacy development, but clearly the strongest case is made when we can examine through behavioural data whether our predictions about what readers learn from the written input are supported. So I'd just like to say thank you. Well, thank you for inviting us to present this work, and also to our co-authors Alvin and Nalangina, who aren't able to be part of the session.
Thank you. Thank you for that presentation. And as I said, this perhaps is one of the largest child-directed print corpus internationally. There's a question in the chat which is basically asking, how did you work out your suffix frequencies? What was your source? Was it suffixes from conversational units or print units?
So the suffixes were identified from the text of the So it was
the text frequency.
It was the text, yeah. So we basically developed a frequency, word list essentially of the entire corpus, which, as you can imagine, was quite huge. And then we cross-referenced the words in that list with this Morpholex database, which is a great resource if you're interested in morphology in English. Which, as I say, already had done all the hard work of the kind of segmentation process. As I say, a lot of the words that were in the children's corpus didn't appear in the Morpholex database because the corpus was bigger. So that was where our kind of hand coding came in, and we generally tried to follow the principles that were outlined in the Morpholex paper so that we were being consistent. But, as I say, there were decisions that had to be made that where how you segment a word wasn't always very obvious. And I should say as well, actually, that the suffix frequencies we calculated, it was another sort of decision that we went back and forth on, but in the end we decided just to look at suffix frequencies where that suffix appears in word final position. So if there was a derivational suffix kind of embedded within a word, we didn't count that one because obviously it's the word final suffix that determines part of speech. And there's actually very little experimental data kind of looking at how readers process those sort of multi-morphemic words where there's multiple layers of affixation, certainly in English. I mean, I'm not sure about other languages, but
yeah. And I think Filipino is a good example of infixes and circumfixes. And we will have some experimental work on that